The morning Georgia Quinn rode into the Talbot spread with a branding iron balanced across her saddlebag, and fury burning quiet and steady behind her green eyes. Nobody in Cutter's Creek had ever seen anything quite like it, and nobody who witnessed it would ever forget the day the dust settled, and two stubborn hearts learned what it meant to belong to something more than just land. It was the autumn of 1878 in the Texas Panhandle, a stretch of country so vast and unforgiving that the sky alone could break a person if they were not careful. The land out there had a way of testing everything: iron, wood, bone, and will. Georgia Quinn had been tested plenty. She had buried her father 3 months prior, a man named Elias Quinn, who had spent 22 years carving a cattle operation out of nothing but red dirt and prayer. She was 26 years old, and she had watched that land eat her father alive the way the land out there always eventually did, slowly and without apology. What Elias Quinn left behind was roughly 400 head of decent longhorn cattle, a two-room house that needed a new roof, a foreman named Pete Driscoll who had already started looking sideways at her authority, and about 1,000 acres of lease rights that butted directly up against the Talbot Range. Harvey Talbot owned the land to the north, east, and partway west of her. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through the jaw, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar because he was always a week late getting a haircut. He had built the Talbot Crossing Ranch himself from a land grant and what his father had left him, which was not much besides a decent horse and a lesson about never borrowing money from people who smiled too easy. He ran close to 800 head of cattle, employed 6 working cowboys, and had a reputation in Cutter's Creek for being fair but absolutely immovable once he decided something was right. The town trusted him. The Cattlemen's Association had twice offered him the chairmanship, and he had twice declined because he did not care much for meetings or politics, only work. The trouble between the two ranches had been building since the summer fence line separating Quinn land from Talbot land had taken damage in a flash flood. It was the kind of flood that swept down the dry creek beds with no warning, all thunder and brown water, and afterward, 300 yards of cedar post fence simply gone. Georgia had asked Pete Driscoll twice to organize the repair, and twice something else had come up. Harvey Talbot, whose cattle ran the northern side of that wash, had sent his own men in to drive back whatever strays had crossed over during the confusion, but in the chaos of moving animals in unfamiliar territory, a handful of unbranded Quinn calves had ended up with the Talbot herd. Neither party had known this with certainty until branding season arrived. Harvey ran his brandings as events. Not celebrations exactly, but organized, serious days of real work that involved his full crew plus occasionally neighboring ranchers who traded labor. On a cool October Tuesday, his yard was filled with the smell of wood smoke and hot iron, the bellowing of calves, the creak of rope, and the low, efficient conversation of men who knew exactly what they were doing. His lead hand, a weathered man named Cobb Weaver who had been roping cattle for 30 years, had the work running smoothly by the time the sun had fully cleared the hills. That was when Georgia Quinn appeared at the edge of the yard. She came in at a slow walk on her sorrel mare, and every man in that yard turned to look because a lone woman riding in that way, without escort, without announcement, was something worth looking at regardless of the circumstance. She wore a plain brown riding skirt, a cream blouse that had been patched at the left elbow, a wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to her father, and around her wrist she carried her own branding iron, the letter Q with a line beneath it, the Quinn mark, tied there with a strip of leather. She was not carrying it carelessly. She was carrying it the way you carry something you fully intend to use. Harvey Talbot was at the far end of the yard when she rode in. He heard the shift in the noise first, the way men's voices drop when something unexpected enters a scene, and he straightened up from where he had been crouching over a log record book and looked across the yard and saw her. His first thought was practical. He recognized her. He had seen her once before, at her father's funeral, standing at the graveside with that particular stillness that people use to hold grief inside themselves when they do not want to let it out in public. He had not spoken to her that day. It had not felt like the right moment, and besides, his foreman Cobb had handled all the boundary matter conversations through Pete Driscoll for weeks. His second thought, which followed so quickly behind the first that it nearly stepped on it, was that she was the most determined-looking person he had ever seen arrive on a horse. He walked toward her directly, because leaving a person sitting on a horse in the middle of your working yard was not how he did things. Georgia watched him come. She had been watching him from the moment she arrived, cataloging what she knew and what she did not. She knew the Talbot name. She knew this ranch produced good cattle and had a clean reputation. She did not know this particular man beyond his name, and the fact that in the weeks since her father's death, several of her branded cows and what she believed were at least 8 or 9 unbranded calves had drifted through that ruined fence line and were quite possibly standing somewhere in this yard, right now wearing Talbot's mark or waiting to receive it. She had told Pete Driscoll she was coming. Pete had looked at her with that sideways look he had been developing lately and said she might want to let him handle it. She had taken her iron off the wall, tied it to her saddle, and ridden out without another word to him. Harvey stopped a respectful distance from her horse. He took off his hat because his mother had raised him with manners even when everything else was rough. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said. There was a pause in which the whole yard seemed to hold its breath, the way air holds before a storm decides which direction to go. "My cattle are mixed in with yours," she said. Her voice was level and clear. She was not accusing him. She was stating a fact the way you state that the sky is large or the ground is hard. "I have 4 branded cows I can identify by ear notch and brand, and somewhere between 8 and 12 unbranded calves that dropped on my pasture this spring. The flood took the fence. I am not suggesting you did anything wrong. I am suggesting that I would like to be present for your branding today, and that any animal I can identify as mine receives my iron, not yours." Harvey looked at her for a moment. He looked at the iron tied to her wrist. He looked at her face, which was completely serious. Several things were happening inside him simultaneously. The rancher part of him was already running through the logic, the flood, the damaged fence, the strays, the timing. It was entirely plausible. It was actually quite likely. He had not personally counted unbranded calves against his expected numbers, because that was record work he usually did at the end of the season, and Cobb had not flagged anything unusual. But 8 to 12 unbranded calves was not a number so large as to be impossible in the shuffle. The other part of him, the part that was simply a man looking at a woman who had ridden here alone with her own iron tied to her wrist because she was not willing to let anyone take what was rightfully hers, felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. "All right," he said. She blinked. She had been prepared for an argument. "All right," she repeated. "You ride through the holding pen and identify what's yours," he said. "My man Cobb will be with you to verify, and we will mark anything you can legitimately claim before it gets my iron. That's fair." She studied him for another moment. She had prepared herself for a fight, and he had simply agreed with her, which was somehow more disarming than any argument would have been. "Thank you," she said, and the 2 words came out slightly rougher than she intended because she had been holding a great deal of tension in her throat the entire ride over. He nodded and replaced his hat, and then he turned to Cobb and said, "Work with Miss Quinn today. Whatever she identifies, document it and set it aside for her mark before it comes through the chute." Cobb, who had been ranching long enough to have seen most everything, simply said, "Yes, sir," and looked at Georgia with the evaluating eyes of an old working cowboy who was deciding whether the person across from him knew cattle or was guessing. Georgia swung down from her horse with easy practice and tied the mare at the rail and walked into the holding pen with Cobb at her side. And within the first 20 minutes, It was clear to every man in that yard that she knew cattle. Not just the way a rancher's daughter who had watched from the porch knew cattle, but the way someone who had worked them personally, in the mud and heat and smell of it, knew them. She identified two branded Quinn cows immediately by ear notch and brand. She moved through the calves with a focused, unhurried eye, and by mid-morning she had identified 9 calves she was prepared to stand behind as Quinn animals, with reason given for each one. This one's mother was that spotted cow there. This one had the particular jaw shape of the Quinn line. This one had been born in the South pasture, and she had personally witnessed the birth. Harvey watched her work from a distance while pretending to do his own paperwork. He was not entirely pretending. He genuinely needed the paperwork done, but he watched. There was one moment, mid-morning, when a yearling broke from the pen and bolted along the fence line in Georgia, without apparent thought, stepped sideways with a speed that suggested pure muscle memory, and caught the lead rope that Cobb threw her and brought the animal back around in a clean, smooth motion that required real strength and real knowledge. Cobb looked at Harvey across the yard. Harvey looked back at Cobb. Neither of them said anything out loud, but the look was a full conversation. By noon, Georgia had identified and set aside for her own iron 11 calves and 2 cows. Harvey's tally showed him a total slightly lower than he had expected for the season, which, combined with her numbers, made the math work out neatly enough. His cook, a stocky man named Augusto who made food that was simple, plentiful, and very good, had prepared a noon meal for the full crew, and Harvey called a break with the ease of a man who understood that fed workers were better workers. He nodded to Georgia as she came out of the holding pen, dusty and warm from the morning. "Come eat," he said. It was not an elaborate invitation. She hesitated for only a moment. She had not planned to stay for a meal. She had planned to do her business and leave with her cattle, and that would be that. But she had been on the trail since before sunrise, and her stomach was making its own argument. She washed her hands at the pump and sat at the end of the long outdoor table where the crew ate, and Harvey sat at the other end. And for a while the conversation around the table was all ranch talk, weather, cattle numbers, the price of beef in Amarillo, whether the railroad spur being discussed for Cutter's Creek would actually happen or would remain a rumor for another decade. Georgia ate and listened and occasionally contributed a word or two when something was said that touched on her own experience, and Harvey noticed that when she spoke, the men near her actually stopped to listen, which was not something that happened automatically. It was something that happened because the thing being said had weight to it. After the meal, while the crew was drinking coffee and getting ready to resume, Harvey found himself standing near Georgia at the pump again, not by any particular plan, just by the way two people end up beside each other when a yard is large but not infinite. "Your father ran good cattle," he said. She turned to look at him. "He did," she said. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "I meant to say it at the service, but it did not feel like the right moment." She looked at him with some surprise. "You were there," she said. "I was. I did not see you. I stood in the back," he said. "I did not know your father well enough to stand in the front, but I knew him well enough to come." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see something shift very slightly in her face, some easing of a tension she carried so constantly she might not have known it was there. "He would have come to yours," she said finally. "I believe that." Another pause, and then she said, "I am going to keep the ranch running." In case that was a question anywhere in your mind. He had not been about to question it, but he understood why she said it. "I did not doubt it," he said. She looked at him steadily, trying to determine if he was being polite or honest. After a moment she seemed to decide it was honest, and she nodded and turned back to the pen because there was still work to do. The afternoon was a busy, smoky, loud continuation of the morning, and Georgia worked her calves through the chute herself, taking her iron from the fire with practiced hands and applying the Quinn mark to 11 calves that were, as of that day, unambiguously her property. Harvey watched from nearby, not hovering, just present, and there was something in the solidity of his presence that she was aware of without wanting to be. He did not offer to do it for her. He did not stand too close. He did not give advice she had not asked for. He simply made it possible for the work to happen and then let her do the work. When the last calf was done and the fire was cooling and the crew was beginning the evening chores, Georgia collected her iron and untied her mare and was preparing to load her small recovered herd into the temporary pen she had asked Cobb to arrange when Harvey walked over again. "The fence line," he said. "I know," she said. "I will have it repaired before winter." "I was going to say," he said, "that I have cedar posts left from a project that finished early this year, more than I need. I will send them over. It would be a waste to let them sit." She looked at him with that same careful evaluation she had been applying to him all day, looking for the angle, looking for what he wanted in return, because in her experience nothing was offered without a return expected. She found nothing. He just looked back at her with steady, dark eyes that contained no calculation she could locate. "I will pay for them," she said. "They would rot otherwise," he said. "But suit yourself." He had said it in a way that made it impossible to argue without being difficult about a genuine offer, and she was many things, but she was not unnecessarily difficult. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She rode home in the long October light with 11 cattle that were rightfully hers, and a mind that was slightly more occupied with Harvey Talbot than she had expected it to be. Pete Driscoll was sitting on the porch when she got back. He watched her come in with the cattle without helping, which told her everything she needed to know about where things were heading with him. "Well," he said, "you got them." "I did," she said. "I suppose Talbot put up a fight." "No," she said. "He did not." Pete looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "Men like Talbot are charming until they are not," he said. She dismounted and began unsaddling her mare without looking at him. "I am aware that charm exists," she said, "and I am aware that it can be used in both directions. I went there for my cattle and I came home with my cattle. Everything else is none of your concern." Pete went inside without another word, and Georgia stood in the fading light with her mare and thought about the kind of man who took his hat off when he spoke to you and sent cedar posts because otherwise they would rot. And she told herself very firmly that she had a ranch to run, and sentiment was a luxury she could not currently afford. The cedar posts arrived 2 days later, delivered by a quiet Talbot hand named Jesse who asked no questions, accepted a cup of coffee from Georgia, and left. She and the 2 remaining Quinn hands, brothers named Cal and Del Ferris, spent the following week repairing the fence line. It was hard work in cold autumn air, and Georgia worked alongside Cal and Del every day. And by the end of the week the fence was straight and solid, and she felt, for the first time since her father had died, that something had been made right. The second time she saw Harvey Talbot was at the general store in Cutter's Creek, which was run by a man named Theodore Watts who stocked everything from flour to horseshoe nails and kept the only decent postal service within 40 miles. Georgia was there for the usual supplies: flour, coffee, salt, a new wick for the oil lamp, and Harvey was there because he needed rope and had apparently also needed to mail a letter, which he was standing at the counter concluding when Georgia came through the door with her list. Theodore greeted them both with the slightly too interested manner of a man who spent his days at the center of a small town's information flow and noticed everything. "Miss Quinn," Harvey said, nodding, and moved aside to give her room at the counter. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "the posts were good quality. The fence is done." "I am glad to hear it," he said. Theodore was watching them with transparent fascination. Georgia focused on her list. Harvey, who had apparently concluded his postal business, should have left, but instead he stood looking at a display of harness hardware near the window with the concentration of a man who had not decided whether to go yet. Georgia ordered her supplies, and while Theodore was measuring flour she said, without turning around, "You are looking at that harness hardware like it owes you money." There was a pause, and then Harvey said, "I am trying to decide if I need a new latigo or if mine will make it through the winter." "If you are debating it, it will not make it through the winter," she said. He made a sound that was almost but not quite a laugh. She did not turn around, but she was aware that she was very slightly smiling at the flour barrel. He bought the latigo. They left the store at roughly the same time and stood for a moment outside on the plank sidewalk while their horses stood patient at the rail. "How is the ranch?" he said, and his voice was quieter than in the store, without Theodore's interested ears nearby. "Managing," she said. "Pete Driscoll handed me his notice yesterday." "I am sorry," he said. He seemed to mean it. She lifted one shoulder. He did not believe a woman could run a cattle operation on her own. "I would rather know that now than have a foreman who thinks it but does not say it." "He is wrong," Harvey said simply. She looked at him again. "You do not know the full measure of what I can and cannot do," she said. "I know what I saw last Tuesday," he said. The plainness of it stopped her argument before it could start. She looked at the street instead, the dust and the board buildings of Cutter's Creek, the blacksmith shop and the small church and the livery and the general store and the saloon that had recently gotten a new sign, all of it washed in the flat bright light of a cool October noon. "I need a new foreman," she said. It was half thinking aloud, not entirely directed at him. "Cobb's nephew came through looking for work last week," he said. "I did not have a place for him, but he is a solid hand. Grew up on cattle. I can send him your way if you want to look." She turned to look at him directly. "Why would you do that?" she said. "Because you need a foreman and he needs work," Harvey said, as if the reason were obvious and contained no mystery. She studied him for a long moment. He met her gaze without shifting, without the self-conscious smile men often used when being assessed. He was simply there, solid as the hitching rail, completely unperformed. "Send him over," she said. The nephew's name was Arlo Weaver, 23 years old, lean and capable and entirely lacking in Pete Driscoll's particular brand of condescension. Georgia hired him after 2 hours of conversation and a test ride through the Quinn cattle that he handled without showing off or making errors. He proved to be exactly what Harvey had described, and the ranch began to move more smoothly within a week. She thought about that. She thought about a man who paid attention to his employees carefully enough to know the quality of their nephews, who apparently kept track of people looking for work not for his own use, but in case they could be sent usefully somewhere else. She had known men who were generous with money. She had not known many who were generous with the particular kind of attention that made you feel seen and considered. She filed the thought away and got back to work, because the cattle did not care about her internal life. November came down hard on the Texas Panhandle, not with heavy snow but with cold wind that drove the temperature down and made everything more difficult. Georgia spent her days on horseback regardless, because you did not run cattle from inside a house, and her evenings bent over her father's account books trying to understand the full picture of what she had inherited. The picture was not catastrophic, but it required care. She needed one good selling season, minimal losses through the winter, and she would come out on solid footing. 2 bad things happening at once would tip the balance. She was thinking about this on a gray November afternoon when she heard hoofbeats in her yard and looked out to see Harvey Talbot dismounting at her gate. He tied his horse and came to the door, and she opened it before he could knock because she had seen him through the window and she was not going to pretend she had not. "Mr. Talbot," she said. "Miss Quinn." He held his hat in his hands. "I wanted to let you know that there is a blizzard coming according to all the signs. The old-timer at the livery has been right about weather for 30 years. He says 3 days, maybe 4. She looked at the sky. The clouds were the particular flat gray that, she realized now that he said it, did have the look of something serious building. "I know you are short-handed," he said. "I have my crew doing extra prep today and tomorrow. I can spare 2 men Thursday morning to help you get your cattle into the lower pasture and your feed stores sorted before it hits." She opened her mouth to say she would manage. The word stopped somewhere in her throat because the truth was that with Arlo and Cal and Dell, she had 3 hands total, and if the blizzard was as described, 3 hands would be enough only if everything went perfectly, and things in a blizzard did not go perfectly. "Thursday morning," she said. "By 6, he said. "I will have coffee ready," she said. Something shifted in his face, very briefly, something that might have been relief or might have been something softer, and then he put his hat back on and nodded and rode out. The blizzard arrived exactly as predicted on Thursday afternoon, but by then the Quinn cattle were in the lower pasture with windbreak and water access, and the feed was stored and covered, and Georgia and Arlo and the Ferris brothers and 2 Talbot hands named Marcos and Bo had spent the morning in good, hard cooperative work that got everything done by noon. Harvey himself arrived at 10 in the morning with a wagon carrying extra hay, which he said was because he had bought more than he needed this year and had nowhere else to put it. And she believed this explanation about as much as she believed the cedar posts had been in danger of rotting. But she also accepted that some people simply operated through practical-sounding gestures rather than declarations, and she was beginning to think that was not the worst way for a person to be. They were all inside the Quinn house drinking the coffee she had promised when the first real blast of wind hit, rattling the window in its frame with a sound like a fist. Georgia looked at the window. Harvey looked at Georgia. "You should ride back before it gets worse," she said. "Already too late," Marcos said from near the door where he had looked out. "That is a proper storm." Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Georgia without making a large thing of it, "Is there room here?" There were 5 men, herself, in a 2-room house. Room was relative. "It is a floor," she said, "but it is a dry floor." "A dry floor is fine," Harvey said. They rode out the storm in the Quinn house for 2 nights. Georgia cooked what she had, which was enough. The men worked in shifts between the blasts to check on the livestock and report back. Harvey, she noticed, never sent the other men on a check he was not willing to do himself, which meant he spent fully as much time out in the freezing wind as anyone else. When they came back inside with cold reddened faces and ice on their coat collars, the general procedure was coffee, warmth, and resumed conversation, which over 2 days of enforced closeness became increasingly real. On the second evening, with the storm outside reaching its full velocity and the fire inside making a warm circle that everyone sat close to, Harvey found himself sitting near Georgia at the table because the benches were limited, and the floor was taken up by Arlo and the Ferris brothers, who had fallen asleep like dogs, comfortable with the simple practical fact of it. Marcos and Bo had taken the smaller room. They talked. Not about cattle or weather or ranch logistics, but actually talked, in the way that occasionally becomes possible when darkness and wind outside remove the usual context and leave people simply as people. She told him about her father, about the particular quality of his stubbornness that had been both his greatest strength and the thing that had ultimately exhausted him, about how she had spent her whole life learning this land from him and had done it because she loved it, not because someone required it of her. He told her about his early years, about how the Talbot grant had been a patch of hard ground that nobody else had wanted, about the first winter when he had lost 30 head and had sat alone in a tent because the house was not yet built and had simply decided that leaving was not something he was going to do. "What made you decide that?" she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. "My father ran from everything," he said. "He ran from debt, from bad decisions, from people he had let down. He was always just about to go somewhere else and start over. He died in a rented room in Kansas City with nothing but a decent horse and the address of a man he owed money to in his pocket." He paused. "I decided that I would be a man who stayed put when staying was hard. That if I built something, it would be because I built it and I would stand next to it." Georgia was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed itself against the walls as if trying to find a way in. "My mother left," she said, "when I was 9. She said the land was too much and my father loved it more than he loved her, and she was probably right about both things." She looked at her own hands on the table. "I never blamed her. I understood it. but I also understood that I was not going to be someone who found the land too much. You were 9 years old, he said, and you decided that. I was 9 years old in the middle of nowhere, Texas, with a father who cried for 6 weeks and then went back to work, she said, and the land was what there was. He looked at her in the firelight with an expression she could not entirely catalog, something steady and careful, and full of a recognition she was not sure she had experienced before. Georgia, he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land differently than names usually did. Harvey, she said, trying it out, and watched something warm move through his expression at the sound of it. I am going to say something, he said, and I want you to know that if you tell me it is none of my business, I will accept that. Say it, she said. You should not have to manage what you are managing alone, he said, not because you cannot. You clearly can, but because you should not have to. She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire popped. The wind howled. Arlo shifted in his sleep on the floor, and Cal Ferris snored once and was quiet. I have been alone since I was 9 years old, she said, in the essential way. I know, he said. Me too. They stayed awake talking until well past midnight, and when the conversation eventually ran down into a comfortable quiet, neither of them moved to go to sleep immediately, but just sat in the warmth of the fire and the knowledge of the other person nearby. And Georgia Quinn, who had not permitted herself anything resembling softness in quite a long time, felt something loosen in her chest like a knot coming undone. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The world outside was washed clean and impossibly bright, everything coated in thin ice that caught the sunrise and turned the whole Texas Panhandle into a landscape made of light. Harvey and his men rode out after a breakfast that Georgia made with the last of the good coffee. There was a moment at the gate where Harvey paused with his hand on his horse's neck and looked at her, and she stood at the edge of the porch and looked at him. And the space between them was full of something that had been building for 3 days in close quarters, and before that, across a busy branding yard. And before that, in whatever small ways, 2 neighboring ranches acknowledged each other's existence. Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks, he said. Cutter's Creek does a gathering at the church. I know, she said. I would like to escort you, he said, if you are willing. She had not expected the directness of it and felt warmth rise in her face, which she decided not to be embarrassed about. I am willing, she said. He nodded, put his hat on, mounted his horse, and rode out with his men, and Georgia watched them go and then turned back to her house that felt suddenly quieter in a way that was not exactly bad, just noticeable. The next 3 weeks were busy in the way that November on a working ranch was always busy winterizing equipment, checking on the cattle in the lower pasture, accounting for feed stores, the 1,000 small tasks that stacked up without mercy. She saw Harvey twice more before Thanksgiving, once at the feed store when they were both picking up supplies, and stood talking in the cold outside for 20 minutes about nothing in particular that was nevertheless entirely pleasant, and once when he rode the fence line that bordered their properties and stopped at the gate she was working on with Arlo to say that the fence on his side was holding well, and he had reinforced 2 posts. Each time she saw him, she found herself noticing things. The way his voice dropped when he said something he meant very seriously, as if he were turning the volume down to indicate the words mattered. The way he handled his horse, which was not the showy horsemanship of a man performing capability, but the automatic ease of someone who had been around horses their entire life and trusted them the way you trust people you have known a long time. The way he spoke to Arlo and the Ferris brothers, when he encountered them, man to man, and without the slightly raised chin that some owners of large operations used when addressing men who worked for smaller ones. She also noticed that she was noticing all of this, and she had a very direct internal conversation with herself about what that meant, which resulted in no particular resolution except the acknowledgement that it was happening, and she was going to let it happen and see what it became. Thanksgiving gathering at the Cutter's Creek Church was a combination of community meal and social event that the whole town and the surrounding ranches participated in every year. Long tables were set up inside and outside the little white church, and everyone brought food, and the minister said a prayer that went a bit long, and then people ate and talked, and the children ran wild, and the whole thing lasted from midday to nearly dark. Harvey arrived at the Quinn ranch at 11 in the morning with a wagon because he said it was too cold to ride horseback to a social gathering if you did not have to. He had cleaned up, she noticed, with the slightly overly careful look of a man who had taken care with his appearance without wanting it to be obvious that he had taken care. He had gotten his hair cut, and it suited him. She had put on her good dress, which was deep green wool that her father had bought her 2 Christmases ago, and she had done her hair up, and when she came out of the house and saw Harvey standing at the wagon, she saw his face do something involuntary that pleased her very much. "You look beautiful," he said, and then looked briefly as if he had not been sure he was going to say it out loud. "Thank you," she said, and let him help her up onto the wagon seat, which she could have managed on her own but chose not to, for the pleasure of his hand at her elbow and the solid, ordinary closeness of it. They rode into town side by side on the wagon bench and talked about the price of cattle, and whether the Cutter's Creek School needed a new teacher, and whether the Mercantile was going to finally stock a better grade of coffee. And all of it was perfectly ordinary and perfectly enjoyable in a way that felt significant to both of them precisely because of its ordinariness. At the gathering, Georgia was greeted by people she had known her whole life, and she was greeted with Harvey beside her, which generated a pleasant low current of interested attention from the town that both of them were aware of and neither of them addressed directly. Harvey was easy with people, she noticed, genuinely easy, not the performance of easiness but the real thing. He shook hands and listened and laughed at appropriate moments, and introduced her in the specific way that told the people he introduced her to that she was someone to be taken seriously. Ada Morse, who was the minister's wife and ran the women's sewing circle, and was regarded by everyone in Cutter's Creek as the authoritative record of community social life, took Georgia's arm at one point and said with warm directness, "It is good to see you looking well, Georgia, and it is very good to see the company you are in." Georgia smiled and said, "Ada," in a tone that conveyed appreciation and gentle warning simultaneously. Ada beamed and moved along. Harvey had found her again after a conversation with some of the other ranchers and handed her a cup of warm cider. "You have been claimed by Ada Morse," he said. "I have been assessed and approved by Ada Morse," Georgia said. "There is a difference." "What does approval from Ada Morse mean?" he asked. "In Cutter's Creek." "It means more than a land deed," she said, and he laughed. A full, genuine laugh that she had not heard from him before, and the sound of it was remarkably good. They drove home in the early dark, the sky enormous above them and full of cold stars, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that 2 people only find when they have already said enough important things that quiet is not threatening. At her gate, he helped her down from the wagon and did not immediately let go of her hand. "I have enjoyed this day a great deal," he said. "So have I," she said. He was standing very close in the way that happened when a moment had arrived, and both people knew it. She looked up at him, and the starlight was enough to see his face, and he was looking at her with an expression of such plain and earnest feeling that she felt it strike against her chest like a bell. He kissed her, slowly and carefully, the way a person kisses someone they have been thinking about for weeks and intend to keep thinking about for a very long time. She kissed him back with a thoroughness that she suspected told him everything he needed to know about how she felt. When they stopped, they stood close together in the cold air with the night enormous around them, and Georgia Quinn, who had been practical and independent and unaccompanied for the better part of her adult life, felt entirely at peace with the idea that that particular chapter was ending. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. He drove home. She went inside and stood by the fire for a long time without needing to do anything except be, which was its own kind of remarkable. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of 1878 in the Texas Panhandle, both proper and accelerated. Proper in that Harvey called at the Quinn Ranch regularly, always at reasonable hours, always with Arlo or the Ferris brothers somewhere nearby, because a woman's reputation was a real and practical concern in a small community, and both Harvey and Georgia were clear-eyed about the world they lived in. Accelerated in the sense that two people who were both past the age of easy romanticism, and who had spent significant portions of their lives alone, tend to recognize what they have found with a speed that younger people, with all the time in the world ahead of them, sometimes cannot afford. He came on Sunday afternoons, and they rode together over both ranges, which was actually useful work because knowing your neighbor's land when you shared fence lines was practically sensible, and also entirely an excuse to spend time together on horseback, which suited both of them because they were people who thought more clearly on a horse than anywhere else. He came for meals on Tuesday evenings with enough regularity that Arlo, who had a dry and gentle humor, started having the second coffee cup on the table before Harvey arrived. She went to the Talbot Crossing Ranch twice in December, once to look at a bull he had acquired and was considering whether to breed to some of her line, which was a legitimate and useful conversation that also happened to involve spending the afternoon at his ranch, and having supper with Cobb and a few of the hands, and seeing the way Harvey Talbot moved through his own spaces comfortable, unhurried, attentive to everything around him in the unshowy way of someone who simply found the world interesting. The second time she went to Talbot Crossing was to bring him a Christmas cake that she had made from a recipe of her grandmother's, because she had baked it, and there was too much of it for one person, and he happened to live next door. And if she had taken slightly more care with the baking than usual that was between her and the kitchen. He accepted the cake with a solemnity that she eventually realized meant he was trying very hard not to smile too broadly, and she told him he could smile, and he did, and she stayed for 3 hours and they sat by his fire, and she told him things about herself that she had not told anyone in a very long time, and he told her things in return, and when she rode home in the cold December dusk, she was as certain as she had ever been of anything that she was in love with Harvey Talbot. She did not say this out loud to anyone, not even to herself in full explicit terms, because she was Georgia Quinn, and she expressed things through action rather than declaration. But Arlo, who was perceptive in the way that people who work alone on the land tend to be perceptive, looked at her when she came home that evening and said only, "Good visit." And she said, "Yes," and he nodded and went back to his work, and that was all that needed to be said. December in the Texas Panhandle was cold but bright, with the particular clarity that comes when the air has nothing left in it but itself. Georgia worked her cattle, managed her accounts, wrote letters to the Cattlemen's Association about spring market prices, rode her fence lines with Arlo, and cooked for herself and occasionally for others, and all of it had a quality of being fully inhabited that it had not had in quite the same way since before her father died. Christmas itself was quiet, as she had expected. Harvey brought her a gift, a proper bridle set of very good leather for her sorrel mare, which he had clearly had made to order by the saddler in Amarillo because there was nothing like it for sale in Cutter's Creek. And when she held it, she was struck by the specific thought he had put into it, not flowers or ribbon candy, but something she would use every day, and that acknowledged exactly who she was. She had made him a quilt. She was not a natural quilter, but she had worked at it for 3 weeks in the evenings, and it was warm and solid and built to last, which she thought was appropriate. He held it for a long moment. "You made this," he said. "I did," she said. "Georgia," he said, and stopped, and she could see that he was holding something back, something that wanted to come out, and she waited for it. "I am going to ask you something in the new year," he said. "I want you to know it is coming. I do not want it to be a surprise." She looked at him steadily. "Is that the preview or the thing itself?" she said. "It is the preview," he said. The thing itself I want to do properly. Then I will wait for it, she said. He stayed for Christmas supper, and Arlo and the Ferris brothers were there. And it was a good evening full of food and warmth, and the kind of easy conversation that fills a room without strain. New Year's Eve was marked in Cutter's Creek with a modest gathering at the saloon for the men and a supper at the Morse house for families, and Georgia and Harvey attended the family supper together, which was as public a statement as you could make in Cutter's Creek without actually publishing it in the newspaper. Ada Morse received them with the radiant satisfaction of a woman whose social predictions had been confirmed by the universe. The new year of 1879 began on a cold, clear morning. Georgia was at the Quinn house barn doing morning chores when she heard hoofbeats and looked out to see Harvey arriving, which was early for a visit. He dismounted and tied his horse and walked to the barn door, and she stood in the hay-smelling dimness with a brush in her hand and looked at him. He had dressed well, better than he dressed for regular work. He was holding his hat in both hands. "I said I would do this properly," he said. She set down the brush. "Georgia Quinn," he said, "I have spent most of my life believing that what I was building here was enough, and that being alone in it was simply the trade you made. I did not think that was a complaint, just a fact." He paused. "I was wrong. And I know that now because since October I have not been able to imagine going back to the way things were before." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes that contained nothing performed, just everything genuine. "I love you. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you to keep your ranch your own, your land, your cattle, your name if you want it, but to build something with me that belongs to both of us. I am asking because I want to spend the rest of my days with you, and because I believe we are better together than either of us is alone." Georgia stood in the barn in the cold January morning and looked at the man she had ridden to see 3 months ago with her branding iron and a head full of righteous practicality, who had taken his hat off and agreed with her and sent cedar posts and weathered a blizzard on her floor and kissed her under winter stars and given her mare a beautiful bridle, and she felt love move through her like water finding its course, natural and inevitable and completely without resistance. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He closed the distance between them and took her in his arms with a careful, fierce tenderness that told her everything about the depth of what he had been holding, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt entirely at home in a way she had not felt anywhere, even on her own land, in a very long time. They were married in March of 1879 in the Cutter's Creek Church by the minister whose Thanksgiving prayer had gone a bit long. The whole town came. Arlo and the Ferris brothers were there, and Cobb Weaver stood up with Harvey, and Ada Morse sat in the front row with the expression of a woman watching the natural conclusion of a proper story. The day was clear and cold bright, the sky the deep particular blue that the Panhandle offered in March as a kind of apology for everything it put you through in February. Georgia wore the same green wool dress she had worn to Thanksgiving, because it was the best thing she owned, and because it had been the first time Harvey had looked at her with that involuntary expression she now understood very well, and she wanted to be wearing it when she married him. Harvey, standing at the front of the church, watched her walk down the aisle toward him with an expression that he did not try to manage or contain, plain and full and without any shield at all, and Georgia met his eyes from the first moment she came through the door and did not look away. The vows were the standard words, but they meant them. After the wedding, the question of the two ranches required practical resolution. They discussed it with the directness that characterized how they handled most things. Georgia would keep the Quinn deed and the Quinn brand because that was her father's legacy and her own. Harvey would keep the Talbot Crossing deed and brand. But they would run both operations as a unified effort, shared labor, coordinated seasonal work, fences maintained by both as a mutual boundary rather than opposing ones. They were, in the language of a practical partnership as much as a romantic one, a single enterprise on adjacent land. Pete Driscoll, who had moved on to a ranch south of Amarillo, and heard about the marriage through the regional network of cowhands and former employees, apparently said to whoever would listen that he had seen it coming. Nobody who knew the story gave him much credit for the observation. The spring of 1879 was good. The cattle came through the winter better than predicted. Arlo proved himself so thoroughly in his first season as Georgia's foreman that she doubled his wage, which Arlo accepted with a nod and went back to work. Harvey's crew and the Quinn hands worked the spring roundup together for the first time as a combined operation, and Cobb Weaver and Arlo Weaver, uncle and nephew, worked side by side in the way of people who know each other's rhythms without needing to discuss them. Georgia kept her own books, as Harvey had promised she would, and she kept her own accounts and her own records and made her own decisions about her cattle, and Harvey did the same with his. And once a week in the evenings they sat at the same table and reviewed both sets of books together, and the conversations that came from that were some of the most genuinely interesting of either of their lives. Not only because they were learning each other's operations, but because two minds working on a shared problem produce things that one mind alone cannot. Summer came fierce and hot, as summers in the Panhandle did. The work was relentless. Water management became the central preoccupation of every rancher in the region from June onward, and Harvey and Georgia between them had 3 water sources, which was 2 more than most, and they managed them carefully. In the evenings when the work was done and the heat had released a little, they sat on the porch of the Talbot Crossing house, which was larger and better situated than the Quinn house, and had been expanded slightly before the wedding with a new room that Harvey had built himself, and they talked or were quiet in the comfortable way of people who do not need noise to fill the space between them. She told him she was expecting a child in the late summer, when the summer heat was at its worst, and the cattle were all moved to the northern pastures for the grass. She told him at breakfast, setting the coffee cup in front of him and then sitting across from him and saying it plainly, because that was how she did things. Harvey's face, which she had been watching now for nearly a year and had learned to read like she read weather, went through several things in rapid succession. First a pure, unguarded joy that hit him visibly, then something more complex and careful, then back to joy but quieter and steadier. He reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything for a moment. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. He held her hand and looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible on his face. "I am very happy," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see it." The child was born in February of 1880, in the coldest part of the year, which Georgia had not precisely planned but which Arlo observed was appropriately timed for a Quinn, since the Quinn family apparently did things when they were most difficult and managed them anyway. The baby was a boy, arrived safe and healthy, with Harvey's dark hair and Georgia's green eyes in the startling combination that the midwife said she had never seen on a newborn quite so clearly. They named him Elias Harvey Talbot, Elias for Georgia's father, Harvey for his own father's son who had stayed when staying was hard. Harvey held his son in the first hours with an expression so undefended and full that Georgia, who had just done the significant physical work of bringing this person into the world and was accordingly tired, felt a second wave of love for this man so strong it was almost funny. "Hello, Elias," Harvey said to the baby, who was squinting at the world with the skeptical expression of someone who was not sure what to make of it yet. "He looks like you," Georgia said. "He has your eyes," Harvey said. "He has my father's name," she said, "and I think that means he is going to be stubborn." "He has 2 stubborn parents," Harvey said, "so there was always only one outcome." Young Elias Talbot turned out to be exactly as advertised. A child of considerable will who was also, from his earliest months, a child of considerable charm and warmth. He cut his teeth on the ordinary rough and tumble of ranch life, which was the best possible education for it, spending his days between the 2 houses that constituted his world, equally comfortable with Arlo's quiet and the Ferris brothers' loud and Cobb Weaver's occasional terrifying wisdom, with Harvey's solid calm and Georgia's exact and practical love that expressed itself most naturally through action. Georgia ran her own ranch through all of it. She rode her own cattle through pregnancy and after, modified for season and condition but never stopped, because stopping was not something that occurred to her as an option. Harvey, who had understood from the first branding day exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with, supported this without a word of argument, only making sure she had what she needed, and was never out on the land alone when the conditions did not recommend it. The year 1880 was hard for the broader region in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Cattle prices dropped sharply in the second half of the year, as the railroads opened new markets and oversupply hit the Texas beef market in ways that hurt smaller operations significantly. Georgia had predicted some of this from reading the market reports and the trade papers that came through Cutter's Creek with the Post, and she and Harvey had moved to sell a portion of their combined herd in the spring at good prices, which meant they took less of the autumn hit than most of their neighbors. Several of those neighbors were not so fortunate. The Harmon family, who ran a small spread about 12 miles south, lost enough in the price drop combined with a poor calving season that they faced genuine hardship. Georgia rode out to call on Mary Harmon, who she had known since childhood, and spent an afternoon helping her go through her accounts. And what came from that afternoon was a suggestion that the Harmon cattle could run on the southern Quinn pasture through the winter in exchange for labor, which kept the Harmon cattle alive and gave the Quinn operation 2 extra working hands for the hard months. Harvey observed this arrangement with the quiet admiration he felt regularly for his wife's practical generosity, which was never sentimental and always effective. In the spring of 1881, the Cutter's Creek Cattlemen's Association asked Harvey again to take the chairmanship. He sat with Georgia on the porch for a long evening discussing it. She made the argument that the association was increasingly important as the Texas Panhandle filled up with more homesteaders and farmers whose interests sometimes conflicted with the ranching culture they had built their lives within, and that having someone in the chair who was known to be fair was worth a great deal. "You should take it," she said. "It means meetings," he said. "Harvey," she said, "you have been chairing our weekly account reviews for 2 years and making them interesting. You can manage meetings." He took the chairmanship. He turned out to be exactly as good at it as she had predicted: fair, clear, unwilling to be bullied by the larger operations into positions that hurt the smaller ones, and with the particular talent of someone who listened before they spoke, which in any room is worth considerably more than the reverse. Georgia attended the meetings when she could and sat near the back and said nothing most of the time, but the several times she did speak up, the room attended to her with the focused quiet of people who had learned that when Georgia Talbot chose to use words it was because the words were necessary. They had been married 2 years when Georgia became expectant again. This time, with more confidence in how it would go, the announcement was made over supper with Arlo and the Ferris brothers present, and the response was entirely celebratory. Young Elias, who was now a toddling, determined personality of remarkable focus, appeared not to understand the announcement, but joined enthusiastically in the general good feeling. The second child was born in the autumn of 1881, a girl this time, as healthy as her brother, born with Georgia's coloring and Harvey's broad, calm gaze that seemed from her earliest moments to be simply looking at everything and finding it all interesting. They named her Clara Alois Talbot, Clara for no particular ancestor but simply because it suited her, and Alois for Harvey's mother, who had given him his manners even when everything else was rough. Harvey held Clara for the first time with the same open, unshielded expression he had held Elias, and Georgia watched him with Elias on her lap and the new baby in his arms, and felt the deep, anchoring satisfaction of a life that had arrived fully and without compromise at exactly where it should be. The ranch continued. Good years and harder years alternated in the way they always did in the Panhandle, because the land was not interested in your plans, and the weather could not be negotiated with, and the market moved according to forces hundreds of miles east in cities that did not know or care what it cost to run cattle through a dry summer. But Harvey and Georgia Talbot ran their combined operation with the intelligence of two people who respected each other's thinking, and the resilience of two people who had each already survived significant hardship alone, and were significantly less threatened by difficulty now that they faced it together. They fixed things when things broke. They adapted when the market required adaptation. When the homesteaders began coming in larger numbers in the early 1880s and fencing disputes became a real and pressing issue across the Panhandle, Harvey's chairmanship of the Cattlemen's Association proved its worth as he worked to establish the kind of agreements that prevented violence while protecting established grazing rights. He was not always successful. The period was genuinely contentious, and not all of it was resolved by reasonable conversation, and there were injuries and losses in the region that were part of the broader, painful conflict between old and new ways of using the land. Harvey tried to be on the right side of fairness in it, which sometimes meant disagreeing with the larger ranches, whose methods he considered excessive, and he did so without backing down. There was one afternoon in the spring of 1882 when three riders representing the Dalton operation, the largest ranch in the county, arrived at Talbot Crossing with a message that Harvey interpreted accurately as a threat regarding his position on the fence-cutting issue. He met them in the yard with the particular stillness of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear, and told them that his position was his position, and their employer was welcome to make his case at the next association meeting. The riders left without incident, but not without making clear that the Dalton people considered Harvey an obstacle. Georgia was in the yard the whole time, loading a wagon with supply crates, and the riders had registered her presence without addressing her directly, which she noted with dry internal commentary. After they left, Harvey looked at her and she looked at him. "Dalton will be a problem," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are not going to change your position," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to loading crates. He watched her for a moment with a love so natural and constant it was like the light, just the condition in which everything happened. The Dalton issue worked itself out over the following year through the mechanisms of the association, where Harvey's organized majority position held, and the fence-cutting dispute was ultimately regulated in a way that protected smaller operations without destroying the economics of the larger ones. It was not a complete victory for anyone, which Harvey considered the sign of a genuine resolution. Arlo Weaver had by this point been Georgia's foreman for 4 years, and in the spring of 1882 he came to her with a proposition. He wanted to buy a small piece of her southern acreage, the piece that was least useful for Quinn cattle because of the poor water access, and start his own small operation. He had saved carefully and had the money. Georgia sold him the land at fair value, which was slightly below what the market would have supported, but exactly what she considered right for a man who had served her well and honestly. She helped him write the deed of sale in a way that protected his interests completely. And when Arlo moved into the small house he built on his new property, Georgia and Harvey attended the occasion with a meal and a gift of good breeding stock from the combined Talbot herd. And Arlo shook Harvey's hand and looked at Georgia with an expression of such genuine gratitude that she had to turn away before she showed more feeling than she intended. Cal and Del Ferris remained on the Quinn payroll, which now operated informally as an arm of the combined Talbot operation, and Georgia hired 2 additional hands in 1882 as the Quinn herd grew. The ranch that Elias Quinn had spent 22 years building was, under his daughter's management, in better shape than it had ever been. In the evenings, Georgia and Harvey sat on the porch of Talbot Crossing, or on the porch of the Quinn house on the evenings they slept there, and they watched Elias and Clara play in the yard as the light went golden and long. Harvey had not entirely lost his preference for quiet over talk, and Georgia had not lost her preference for action over declaration. And these things that had been their individual natures had softened against each other without disappearing, which is the best that love can do with character. He still took his hat off when he spoke to her about something that mattered. She still tied things directly to her saddle when she intended to use them. Neither of them had stopped being exactly who they were, which was, they had both independently concluded, entirely the point. Elias grew into a boy who loved horses with the same deep automatic affection his father had, and who asked questions about everything with the relentless curiosity of someone who had inherited both of his parents' intelligence. Clara grew into a girl who approached the world with a measuring calm that made adults feel they were being assessed and usually found wanting, but who also, when she chose to, smiled in a way that entirely undid the assessment. In the summer of 1882, a visiting aunt of Ada Morse's arrived in Cutter's Creek and made the mistake of saying, within Ada's hearing, that it was peculiar that the Quinn property had not been formally absorbed into the Talbot deed upon marriage. Ada, who had been a strong advocate for George's separate deed since the wedding, delivered a response that was reported to Harvey and Georgia secondhand in terms of both its length and its precision. Georgia, upon hearing it, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I should write Ada a letter." Harvey said, "She already knows." Georgia said, "I know she knows. I still want to write the letter." She wrote the letter, which Ada apparently kept. The question of the Quinn deed had, in fact, come up in a legal context the previous year when the county was updating land records, and a clerk had assumed the Quinn land had transferred to Harvey Talbot upon marriage. Harvey had corrected this assumption with such direct and unhurried clarity that the clerk had not only corrected the record, but had apparently left the conversation with a better understanding of property rights in marriage than he had entered it with. Harvey had told Georgia about it over supper that evening, and she had looked at him with a particular quality of love that was different from but not less than the evening porch-watching children quality, something sharp and clear, and very specifically about who he was. By 1883, the combined ranch was running over 1,200 head, the fence lines were solid, the water access was well managed, and the books showed the kind of steady, unspectacular prosperity that comes from doing things correctly over time rather than from any single large gamble. George's accounts were in excellent order. Harvey's were equally so. Combined, they represented one of the healthiest small operations in the county. Harvey was 40 in 1883. Georgia was 31. Elias was 3 years old. Clara was 1.5. And there was general agreement between Arlo and the Ferris brothers that the Talbot children were going to turn out excellent, being as they were the product of two people who had learned everything worth knowing about hard work and doing things right, and had elected, furthermore, to love each other in a way that was entirely clear and unashamed about being exactly that. They had a third child in 1884, another boy whom they named Thomas, because there was no particular symbolism required at this point, and Thomas was simply a solid name for a solid person. Thomas arrived with George's red-brown hair and Harvey's jaw and the combined stubbornness of both parents in a concentrated form that the midwife, who had by this point attended all 3 births, observed aloud as she handed him to Harvey. Harvey said he would consider it a feature. Georgia, from where she was lying down and had just done the significant work, said it was absolutely a feature, and the midwife laughed. The years moved in the way good years do, full and without waste. The Quinn Ranch and the Talbot Crossing Ranch ran side by side as they always had, legally separate and practically unified, which had come to seem to everyone involved as simply the correct arrangement, reflecting as it did the nature of the partnership at the center of it. Georgia kept her iron. It hung on the wall of the Talbot Crossing house, the Quinn mark with the line beneath, and she took it down every branding season as naturally as Harvey took down his own. The combined herds got both marks according to ownership, sorted and documented with the care that both of them brought to everything. There was an afternoon in the spring of 1885 when a new cattleman who had recently bought land in the county attended his first association meeting and asked Harvey, with the slightly too casual tone of someone who thought he was being clever, whether it was not inefficient to run two separate operations out of one household. Harvey looked at him for a moment with the unreadable expression he sometimes used when deciding whether a thing was worth explaining. Then he said, "My wife built her operation herself, and she runs it better than anyone in this county. If you are suggesting it would be more efficient for me to absorb it, you are suggesting that her competence is a problem that needs solving. I do not find her competence a problem." He paused. "Is there something on the agenda you wanted to discuss?" Georgia, who had been in the back of the room, felt the warmth of it all the way from where she was sitting and did not try to control the expression on her face. The new cattleman apparently found other things to discuss. Elias Talbot, at age 5, could already identify cattle by ear notch, having been taken on slow rides through the herd by both his parents since he could sit a horse. Clara, at 3.5, had developed the unsettling ability to walk into a room and immediately identify the most interesting person in it and go directly to them, which Harvey said she had gotten from her mother and Georgia said she had gotten from Harvey, and they agreed the true answer was that she had made it her own. Thomas, at 2, was primarily interested in horses and had an opinion about everything. In the autumn of 1885, Georgia and Harvey sat on the porch of Talbot Crossing on an evening in October, 7 years almost exactly from the day she had ridden into his branding yard with her iron tied to her wrist and her green eyes full of quiet fire. The children were inside with Cobb's wife Ruth, who had moved out to the ranch after Cobb retired from the harder work and settled into a slower role of general maintenance and the unofficial position of person everyone asked when they needed to know something. The air was the exact cold, clear air of a Panhandle October, full of light and the smell of dry grass and the distant sound of cattle, which was the sound both of them had heard their whole lives and which had, in its way, been the first thing they had shared. Harvey had his arm around her and she was leaning against his shoulder in the comfortable, habitual way of two people who have been doing this for years and have not gotten tired of it. "Do you remember the day you rode over with your iron?" he said. "I remember it very clearly," she said. "What were you expecting?" "A fight," she said. "At minimum, a long argument." "I did think about arguing," he said. She looked up at him. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you were right," he said. And because he stopped. "Because," she prompted. "Because you had come all that way alone with your iron tied to your wrist," he said, "and everything about it told me that you were a person who did not do anything without meaning it, and I found that very difficult to argue with." She looked at him with that particular expression she reserved for the moments when he said something that went straight through all her considerable defenses and landed without resistance. "7 years," she said. "7 years," he said. The stars were beginning above the Panhandle, that full, enormous display that the Texas sky put on every clear night, indifferent and magnificent. The cattle moved somewhere in the pasture with the steady sound of animals at ease. Inside the house, one of the children said something and Ruth answered, and there was a brief high sound of laughter that drifted out through the window. "I am glad you did not fight me," Georgia said. "I am glad you came," Harvey said. She turned her head and kissed him, and he held her close in the October night with the firmness of a man who had built everything in his life to last, and Georgia Quinn Talbot, who had ridden out alone with her iron because her cattle were mixed in, and what was hers, felt the completeness of a life that had been built exactly right, on ground she knew, beside a man she loved, with children who were going to be everything the land and the years and the two of them together had made possible. The stars went on above them in their full and ancient numbers, the same stars that had shone over every branding fire and winter storm and fence line and morning ride, over grief and work and stubbornness and love. The same stars that would shine over Elias and Clara and Thomas when they grew and learned and went out onto this land that was already theirs by blood and by right, and by the particular inheritance of parents who had not run from anything. Harvey Talbot and Georgia Quinn had built something together that was exactly equal to the sum of what each of them had brought, which was to say it was large and solid and would stand, and neither of them would have had it any other way. The night settled around them like a quilt, warm and lasting, and they stayed on the porch a long while, saying nothing at all and being entirely at home.